There are 4 or 5 foster carers in the UK who frequently write memoirs, and I am obsessed with them. I have read all of them to date that I know of, and one of the most recent ones to be released is Behind Closed Doors by Maggie Hartley, and as I expected, I absolutely love this. And there's something very unique about the narrative with this one, and that is that it actually involves a well, some of them do involve pretty serious crimes, but this one involves a very different kind of crime to what they usually do because the crime wasn't against the child necessarily. I'm not going to spoil it. I will have to say what that crime is. It's revealed within the first couple of chapters, but I'm absolutely not going to spoil anything about what happens to this child or how the case develops. This was released in January of this year, and I absolutely love Maggie Hartley's books. If you haven't read any of her books, you absolutely do not need to read these in order. But my advice would be to read them in order, just so you can kind of follow her own journey. I think they're pretty linear. I could be wrong. Um, but anyway, this is her most recent one, and she's looking after this young girl who is the most polite girl that I think any foster carer has ever looked after in these books. She is timid and scared to begin with because Nancy, the child's name, finds her father's dead body on the kitchen floor with a knife in his side and blood everywhere. Traumatizing for any child. What I will say is I was quite surprised by the lack of therapy offered to the child immediately, or if it was, it's not really mentioned in the book. Normally, when a child goes through any kind of trauma, but certainly something as severe as this, they are quite quickly, or as quickly as possible, offered some kind of counselling or therapy. And it is briefly touched on that she's going to get grief counselling, but I think she needs a little bit more than that. The book didn't really mention that too much, but I'm just assuming that that is something that will be happening. But obviously, she goes to live with Maggie because her father is in hospital. I believe he was dead at the scene, but they tried to revive him, and then her mother is absolutely nowhere to be seen. So the police have put a call out for her mother. Her father is in hospital, very kind of touch and go, whether or not he's going to make it. Her world is being turned upside down. Maggie is there for her. As the narrative progresses, we find out more about what happened to her father, where her mother may be, and we start to learn more about what their life was like. Now, I feel like it's pretty obvious from the get-go what was happening here. But just in case it's not obvious, I won't go into too much detail. But basically, from the outside, it looks like this family has a perfect life. And the more we dig deeper into this narrative, the more we realise that behind closed doors, hence the title, things are not always as they appear. Pretty good message there that you can't judge a book by its cover. I found the narrative to be very interesting. I found all of the characters, if I can call them that, to be fascinating in one way or another. And while I felt part of it was predictable insofar as I worked out kind of what had happened pretty quickly, but the progression of the case, the police case, the criminal investigation, that for me was exceptionally interesting. Because obviously a crime has happened here. Somebody has stabbed somebody in the side. I won't say who or what or why, but we do get to find out what happens with the court cases surrounding that. That's something I'm deeply fascinated in. So for me, that aspect of it was really interesting. And it was really interesting to find out how Nancy was treated with that and the role the child as a witness played. This is something that occasionally foster carer books will touch upon, but usually it's the child as a victim. So it's a slightly different kind of treatment, which I found to be really fascinating. Nancy as a character was likeable throughout. Yes, I usually prefer foster carer books where the child is maybe misbehaving. I don't want to use the word naughty because usually they're misbehaving because of trauma or neglect or something else. But usually I prefer it where the child causes problems for the foster carer. That sounds awful, but obviously it makes it more interesting to read. But even though Nancy is very sweet, I really liked her. I also found her very believable because there are times where she gets so stressed or so angry at the situation that she she kind of loses her guard and is a little bit, not, she doesn't snap back, but she kind of, there are a few points where she tells Maggie outright that even though it's rude to say this to adults, as she knows, she doesn't want to listen anymore. And there are points where, her true personality underneath this excessive politeness that has been instilled in her starts to come through. My only complaint about this book is that it definitely needs a proofread. I find that this is often the case with not just Maggie Hartley's books, but any of the foster carer books. I feel like the various publishers treat them as a quick win. These are never going to be highbrow literature, and they do sell a lot. So they sell a lot of money. They sell a lot of copies, make a lot of money. They're never going to be highbrow literature. So it's kind of like they say, well, who cares if we don't put our best proofreaders on it? It's always the case. I'd love to just get the manuscript and just read it for them, because it really irritates me when there are so many typing errors in these books, which is kind of a risk as well, because sometimes there was one book, not this one, and I don't know if it was a Maggie Hartley one, but when it comes to proofreading, all of the foster carer memoirs are the same, and they actually called a character by a completely wrong name, and part of me thinks that that's the character's real name, because obviously they use pseudonyms for for the foster carer, but also for the children and their families to protect their identities. So actually, it's really important to proofread these properly to make sure that that doesn't happen. But never mind, it's not so bad that I didn't enjoy it. I did thoroughly enjoy it. If you like these kind of books, definitely give it a go. As I said, I would personally recommend reading Maggie Hartley's books in order. I probably didn't, to be honest. I probably just grabbed the first one off the shelf when I started reading them. So that's my cat having a whinge, if you can hear her. So it's not essential that you do that. If you want to start with this one, certainly, I think that that's fine. Behind Closed Doors was an absolute joy to read.